on the cloud. Okay, and the other one is to share my screen. It's probably the easiest way for you to see what's going on. Okay. So in our first class, we talked a little bit about the background of Shemitah, the laws of Shemitah, in last class, in the reason behind Shemitah, a little bit about the history of Shemitah, the challenges of Shemitah, the lessons that are supposed to be learned from Shemitah. Bein Adam l'makom, God owns everything. Bein Adam l'chavero, that we have to take care of those who are have-nots. And last class we talked about, well, practically, how do you handle yourself during Shemitah? We spent spent a little bit of time as an introduction in last class about how Shemitah B'zman Hazeh, according to many opinions, is D'Rabbanan, and therefore that allows for certain leniencies as to the practice of Shemitah. And we talked about really three ways of handling, the consumer side of handling Shemitah. We didn't go so much into how farmers handle it. If anyone's a farmer and wants to know more about that, maybe we have time. This was sort of the introduction. The idea was soon after Tishrei to start talking about these ideas already at the beginning of the year. Every week in the Shabbat announcements, you'll see a little paragraph about the connection between the Parsha and Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, which is an appropriate area of study all the time, but certainly in a Shemitah year. And so we hope to find other opportunities over the next 9+ months to 10 months to really find expression to the lessons and the halachot and the themes of Shemitah. So tonight we'll be closing out this first mini series on the topic, but stay tuned. There will be other opportunities to explore this. If at the very least the Prusbul, which we'll talk about in this class, which is effectuated according to our custom at the end of the Shemitah year, come El, the week or two before Rosh Hashanah, there will be at least one or multiple sessions to fill out a Prusbul. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let us start. We talked about how Shemitah has an effect on the land of Israel. You're not allowed, you have to let the land lay fallow. You have to allow the produce to be hefker. Everyone has to have access to the produce. Another law of Shemitah, that's called Shemitat Haaretz. Shabbat L'Hashem, the land itself is a sabbatical. The other piece of this is not the land, but the cancellation of debts, right? That's what we see here in source number 1. Let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger. There you go. Oh, too big. Complicated. There we go. So what do we have here? It says, Miketz Sheva Shanim Taseh Shemitah. After 7 years, you make a Shemitah. V'zeh dvar Shemitah. This is the nature of Shemitah. Shamot kol bal mashayado asher yashev re'ehu. Every creditor has to shamot, cancel the debt that he has of his friend, right? Any lender has to cancel the debts that he is holding from his friend, re'ehu. Lo yigos et re'ehu, v'tachiv ki kara Shemitat L'Hashem. So we also see, so you have to cancel the debt. You're not allowed to collect or demand that repayment from your friend because God has created a sabbatical. At Tanachriti goes, this only applies, the cancellation of debts only applies to Jews. To non-Jews, you can demand, call due your loan. But any debt that your fellow Jew has, that your fellow Jew owes to you, you have to cancel. Efes kilo yeh b'chavyon. There will not be one way. Well, there's differences of opinion. I had to read this. If you see the English, there's one interpretation here. Efes kilo yeh b'chavyon ki varech yivarcha Hashem ba'aretz she'Hashem lokecha noten lecha nachala l'rishta. Right. So it's possible that there will not be any poor people in your land. But part of that is dependent on, so one of the way it's translated here, but is that it is possible there shall be no needy among you. However, another interpretation is that there will always be needy among you. We talked about this in the first class, but that's kind of the notion that there'll be haves and have-nots is a reality of life. But Shemitah is about leveling that playing field every once in a while, not completely equitable, but for there to be opportunity for people not to get mired in debt so that they can never get out of it. It shouldn't be that always the rich get richer and the poor remain poor, but there shall be ways of enabling opportunities, right? And the pasuk goes on to say, Ki Hashem Elokecha berecha asher diber lach, lavata goyim rabim atolo tavot ushato goyim rabim chaloyim shalu, right? That God has given us a portion of the land and God has blessed us, right, etc. Pasukim go on to say, and this is connected to the laws of charity. If there's a poor person among you in the land that God has given you, right, don't be stingy, don't close off your heart, right? Right? You should certainly give to them, right? Be careful, right? Right? So we have a connection between the cancellation of debts and charity. Now, again, generally lending money is not charity, because lending money is you get it back. I talk about that, like the difference between contributing to JNF and contributing to Israel bonds, right? Contributing to Jewish National Fund is tzedakah. Contributing to Israel bonds is a loan. It's actually an investment. It's a partnership, right? You expect your money back and maybe even then some, right? They pay a dividend, they pay interest, right? In a permissible way, have no fear. But nonetheless, that's the difference. And so we connect the cancellation of debts in the Shemitah year with the obligation to not to be sensitive to those who are poor and to give charity, even though they're not exactly the same. But it then comes back to the topic of lending and Shemitah. Yisham lacha, right? Be careful, right? Beware lest you harbor the base thought. I'm reading in the English. The seventh year, the year of remission is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt. In other words, what's the concern? The concern is that people, those who are in a position to lend, those who are of means, will notice that Shemitah year is coming. I don't want to lend out any money. I don't want to give any credit, because by requirement of the Torah, I have to allow that loan to be canceled in the Shemitah year. So the Torah says, we know you're thinking that. And so it's almost like the Torah saying, it's okay to think that, but you're not allowed to act upon that, right? Because if the poor cry out because they don't have access to working capital, to equity, that's going to be a problem. Equity in the sense of money to use, right? Give to him readily, right? Atonti chain low. Give him, even in the Shemitah year, have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and all your undertakings, right? So here too, seemingly, and by the way, we saw this, we didn't read the psukim here, but we mentioned this when it came to observing the sabbatical year on the land. Leaving the land fallow for a year seems to be contraindicated if you want to be a successful farmer. And yet God comes along and says, he'll bless your sixth year so that you have enough for the sixth year and the seventh year and the eighth year, even into the ninth year, right? It doesn't make sense, but God is telling us that that's the case. And it's a big test of bitachon. It's a big test in trusting God. So too, when it comes to the cancellation of debts, it's contraindicated, right? How am I going to make money off a debt that I cancel, that never gets paid back? I got to write it off. And if you're not a big company, you can't write off so many debts, right? It doesn't always work for an individual, right? It's not corporate. And nonetheless, the Torah says the more you follow these rules, the more God will bless you, right? So it doesn't seem to work according to the way we understand the world, and that's a test, and it's a way that we express our trust that if we do the right thing, God will pay us back. What do we see from these? So can we see that there are really three mitzvot associated with the cancellation of debts? Number one is to cancel the debt, cancel all debts. And we'll talk a little bit about which debts may be included in this, which debts may not be included in this, what the workarounds are. Of course, we know about principle. We'll get to it. But there's also two negative, that's a positive commandment, right? Cancel your debts. There's also a negative command, two negative commandments associated with it. Number one is lo yigos. You're not allowed, once Shemitah cancels the debt, you are not allowed to collect, demand, order the borrower from paying back, right? Lo yigos. You're not allowed to demand that debt anymore from the borrower. And lastly is what we saw after we talked a little bit about went off tangent a little bit to talk about charity. It came back to Shemitah and told us that you're not allowed to refrain from lending because you're worried about the losses you'll incur in the Shemitah year. Right, so 3 mitzvot: cancel the debt, don't demand the debt that should be canceled, and number 3 is don't hold back from lending from your friend because of your concern about the debt being canceled. Now, the reason for the mitzvah, one reason for the mitzvah is something we saw already in the Rambam or Nevuchim. I believe we saw this source already. I've given it to you here. The Rambam in the guide for the perplexed chapter in the part 3, as to the precepts enumerated in the laws concerning the year of release of Shemitah, some of them imply sympathy with our fellow man and promote the well-being of mankind, right? So that's one element of the mitzvah, which we saw before, the Ben Adam L'Chavero element, which applied by the sabbatical year on the land, as well as the cancellation of debts. Sefer HaChinuch, so that's not necessarily unique to this year, the cancellation of debts. It's a theme that permeates all of the laws in the year of Shemitah. Sefer HaChinuch, though, talks in number 477 in Sefer HaChinuch, does talk about something that's a little bit more specific to this particular law of Shemitah, namely the cancellation of debts, and that is as follows. Follow me on the source sheet. And the release of monies also draws from the same reason: to train our souls in the virtuous traits. Which traits are those? The trait of generosity and a kind eye, an ayin tov, right? So to be benevolent, to be kind, to be generous, and to fix great faith in our hearts towards God, blessed be, right? Bitachon, right? Ayin tov, generous, have faith, bitachon in Hashem, trust that we do what God tells us, then things will work out for us. And then our soul will be prepared to receive the good from the master of all, right? So that's a very interesting and very important for me point that the Sefer HaChinuch makes. It's not only good for society, right? We're not a martyr, right? It's almost like we don't want you to think it's a zero sum, right? It's not a zero sum. When you cancel the debts and that helps those less fortunate, it doesn't mean that the more fortunate lose out, right? We should never view life as zero sum. It should be net value. It should be win-win, right? It should be that if you do good, it is good, right? You do good and it's good for them and it's good for you and it's good for everyone, right? So I think that, to me, that's when I read this Sefer HaChinuch, which makes this point explicitly, that once we're generous and once we have this emunah, then, let me just highlight it, right? Excuse me, sorry. Then our soul, right, will be prepared to receive the good from the master of all, right? It's in our best interest to have this generosity of spirit and this bitachon, this trust in God. One last thing, the Sefer HaChinuch says, another purpose for the cancellation of debt, and also coming from this is a strong fence and partition to distance oneself greatly from theft and from envy for everything that there is to our neighbor, right? So having 1 year where debts are canceled, where you don't collect every last penny that you could, right? The flip side of generosity is being selfish. And part of being selfish is always worrying about what is yours, what could be yours. And sometimes when you worry so much about what could be yours, you dabble in things that aren't really rightfully yours, right? We're always looking for what's mine, what's magieli, what do I deserve, what do I really, what's really owed to me. So you sometimes can cross the line into taking things that don't belong to you. And this is what the Sefer HaChinuch ends with. It's a fence. Canceling debts once every 7 years is a fence to distance ourselves from envy and theft. Of course, they go together, right? When the first step in stealing something is you see it and you want it, and you're jealous of it, you're envious of it, and you take it. It doesn't belong to you, right? So the laws of Shemitah remind us not to be generous, and also not to be envious. And by the way, this is an Ibn Ezra, I believe, when it comes to the 10th commandment of Lo Tachmod, right? When it comes to not coveting, right? The Ibn Ezra says we should view other people's things as not being appropriate for ourselves, right? In other words, if we don't have it, it's because we don't need it. And not only does it not belong to us, but it's bad for us, right? If we don't have it, it's because we're not meant to have it. So don't steal, right? If you covet, you're going to steal, right? And that also plays into bitachon. If you trust that what you have is what God intended you to have, then you're not going to steal other things. You're not going to be jealous of other things, which can lead to, unfortunately, taking things that don't belong to you. So all of this is the purpose, according to the Sefer HaChinuch, of the cancellation of debts: to be generous, to have faith in God, and to be a protection against, a bulwark against greed, and which can lead towards the slippery slope of theft. That's the Sefer HaChinuch. Nowadays, we talked going into, so some of this we learned in the first class because it applies the idea of faith in God and concern for our fellow man, right? That's things we learned in class 1. Let me just reference class 2 when we see the Shulchan Aruch concerning the cancellation of debts. And we already mentioned this last class. Ein Shemitat Kesafim, the very end of the first side of the source sheet, right in front of you now. Ein Shemitat Kesafim nohaget min haTorah el b'zman shayovel noeg, right? That the cancellation of debts is tied into the observance of the Jubilee year. And nowadays, we've lost track of Jubilee, the Yovel, the 50th year, and therefore the cancellation of debts is not a requirement on a Torah level. Right? So 2 things. Number 1 is that Shemitah nowadays is rabbinic, right? Shemitah is no longer a Torah obligation. And number 2, which is worth noting and different than what we've learned already when it came to the sabbatical year agriculturally, is that it applies B'chol makom, these words right here, right? B'chol makom. B'chol makom means everywhere, not just in the land of Israel, but even in the diaspora, right? So we have to be aware of this. Even, right, we talked about how when it comes to the sabbatical of agriculture, so if you're in Israel or if you're a farmer or if they export produce from Israel this year that grew during the Shemitah year, you have to be aware of how to handle that issue. But all of us, anyone who lends money in any way, right, needs to be aware of the ability of Shemitah to cancel debts, right? So it's not just debts that were made in Israel. It's not just debts of people that are residents or inhabitants of the land of Israel. Any Jew around the world, Shemitat Kesafim, the cancellation of debts, is applicable and operable today, not on a Torah level necessarily, but on a rabbinic level nonetheless. The Mishnah in now, how exactly are debts canceled? So look at this Mishnah in Shvi'it. Right, here we go. Move up a little bit. One who returns a debt after the 7th year, right? In other words, the 7th year cancels, and we'll learn a little bit in a moment when exactly during this Shemitah year are the debts canceled. But after that happens, right? If the lender wants to pay back his debt, the creditor must say to the debtor, "I remit it." Right? Meshamet ani in the Hebrew. I cancel the debt. Right? But another interesting point, but the debtor should say, Af al pi kain. Even though the debt has been canceled, I want to pay you. And the creditor may then accept it from him because it says, V'zeh devar hashmita. Right? So the devar hashmita, according to the Mishnah in Shvi'it, the Mishnah in Shvi'it seems to emphasize the need, the requirement on the part of the lender to verbally express, I'm canceling the debt, right? And this is actually a point of contention. It's a machloket among medieval commentaries, the Ureim and the Or Zarua. The Ureim says, like the Mishnah seems to imply, that without expressing these words verbally, Meshamet ani, I am canceling the debt, the loan remains intact, right? Now, if the lender would then demand the loan, he would have a legal right to demand it, but he would violate, right, the other mitzvah that we talked about. Right? One of the mitzvah is not to demand the loan. So the loan exists, but if the lender demands it, he violates that prohibition. Right, and he violates and he neglected the positive commandment of canceling the debt. Right, so the Sefer Yereim, holds that in order for Shemitah Shemitah doesn't automatically cancel debts. Right, Shemitah requires a lender to verbally announce that to cancel debts, and he does so by verbally announcing Meshamet ani, which I underlined. I remit, I cancel the debt. If he doesn't cancel the debt remains due, but the Malveh has neglected the positive commandment of canceling the debt and has violated the negative commandment of not demanding a loan that has been canceled by Shemitah, that should have been canceled by Shemitah, right? Contrast that, right? If you have any questions, please speak up when we do the next piece, and contrast that with the Or Zarua. The Or Zarua says, we don't care what the Malveh says. We don't care what the lender says. The year of Shemitah itself automatically cancels debts. Right? We don't need the lender to say, I'm canceling your debt. It's nice of you to do so. There may be a positive commandment for you to do so, but even without you doing so, the debt is no longer operable. That's the way Shemitah works. So much so that according to the Or Zarua, if I lent you money and Shemitah year comes, and after the Shemitah year I say, or before the Shemitah year is over, I say, I want you to know I am not canceling your debt. You still owe me the money, right? If that was going to be, if that's the case, if that's really the idea, then if you want one of these, then the Or Zarua says it doesn't matter. You could talk all day that you want to that you're not canceling the debt. It doesn't stop the debt from being canceled, because whereas according to the Sefer Yereim, it's the lender who has to cancel the debt, and the Shemitah is the context, the timing, and during which it has to happen. According to the Or Zarua, the year itself cancels the debt. We don't care what the lender says, whether he wants it canceled, whether he doesn't want it canceled. The Torah cancels the debt when the Shemitah year comes. And the Sefer Yereim, Or Zarua would say that the Mishnah, right on the top of the second side, the Mishnah, the first source on the second side, is just telling us that that's how it would traditionally be done. But even if the lender didn't say anything, the loans would be canceled during the Shemitah year, because that's what the Torah says. And we don't need, the lender doesn't have to say anything in order for it to happen. Just as an aside, if you look at the Mishnah 9 in chapter 10, notes, right? So there's this idea that according to the Rambam and according to most opinions, it may not be necessary, but it's appropriate. There's a question whether it's absolutely necessary, right? If the lender doesn't say Meshamet ani, is the loan still due? Most say no, that the year itself is what's Meshamet, but nonetheless, there seems to be a clear mitzvah saseh, a positive commandment for the malveh, for the lender to say, I'm canceling your debt, right? So the lender says, I'm canceling your debt. The loveh is allowed to then say, the borrower is allowed to say, even though you canceled my debt, I want to pay you back anyway, right? You're allowed, without prusbul, without anything, right? The lender says, I canceled your debt. The borrower says, I want to pay you anyway. The Mishnah says in Halacha, in Mishnah 9, one who repays his debt after the 7th year, the sages are pleased with it, right? So it's not that cancellation of paying back, right? If cancellation of debts is all good, then paying back debts would be bad. That's not what we say. We don't say that, right? There's something about the Shemitah year that cancellation of debts is a possibility. But, and what we'll see in a minute is that ideally, Loves would pay back, right? Borrowers would pay back their loan. It just happens to be if they didn't pay back their loan, then Shemitah is able to cancel it. Right? So much so, we'll see in a little bit that let's say there's a loan that's due 10 years from now. It's not due during Shemitah. It's not canceled. There's no cancellation of debts that aren't due during Shemitah. Right? Why? Because ideally, people lend money and those who borrow money pay it back. And we're not going to get involved in that. Right? So if you have a loan due in 2025, really, there's no need for a prusbul. There's no need for Shemitah to be Mishamit. You're good to go. Because we want people to lend money and to those who need to borrow money to pay back the money. And even when Shemitah is Mishamit, even when Shemitah cancels, we say the Lova is perfectly okay to say, even though I don't have to, I want to. Not only that, the rabbis say that's a good thing. It's good for you to pay back the loan that you didn't have to, right? It's a safety net, but it's one that, right? You can think a little bit about politics today, about do people get safety nets automatically, or is a safety net there just in case they need it, right? Cancellation of debts for Shemitah is if they need it, right? But if the loan is due 5 years from now, they don't need it right now, so it doesn't get canceled. And even if the loan gets canceled, we want the Lova to pay back. Maybe not, he's not obligated to do so, but he's certainly encouraged to do so, as we see on the top of the second page of the source sheet. So what's the timing? When exactly does the Shemitah year cancel the debts? So the Rambam says clearly, right, the 7th year only releases money at its end. Shemitah eina mishametas el vasof. Right? You looking for someone? No, we need to. That's okay. Shemitah mishametas el vasof. Right, it's only the last day of the Shemitah year that the loan is canceled. Right, so it's the last erev, the moment before Rosh Hashanah, upcoming year, erev Rosh Hashanah in the afternoon, right before the new year. That's when Shemitah is. That's when the debts are canceled. So all this year, you can collect debts. Right, it's only at the very end of the year that Shemitah, and therefore going into next year will become a problem for those who lent money to collect the debts going into the year 5783. 5782 is a Shemitah year, but the cancellation of debts doesn't occur until the very last moment of the Shemitah year, right? And he proves it from a pasuk that we have at the top of the source sheet, right? The first source. Mikei sheva shanim taseh Shemitah. After 7 years, there's the cancellation of debts, and it actually compares it to another place where we say that by Hakel. That's a shir in itself. Maybe we'll get to that later on in the year, hopefully, right? That Hakel is a special celebration after the Shemitah year on Sukkot, the year after Shemitah year, that the king would read the Torah and everyone would get together, Hakel. And by there it says Hakel is observed Mikei Sheva Shanim, right? So we learn that language, Mikei Sheva Shanim, means towards the end or right after the year of Shemitah. So just as Hakel only applies the Sukkot after Shemitah, at the end of the year, or after the end of the year to be precise. So too, the cancellation of debt, Shemitah Kesafim, only applies Mikei Sheva Shanim, at the end of the Shemitah year, right? So it's not after the Shemitah year, but it's the last moment of this year, 5782. Now the Rosh disagreed. The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, felt that applies, that it's only when that the prohibition of demanding the loan begins at the end of the year, but the Shemitah Kesafim, the actual cancellation of the debt, already occurs at the beginning of the Shemitah year. And the Shulchan Aruch Harav and Chabad custom is to protect against and to be choshesh, to consider the opinion of the Rosh, and to write a prusbul this past Elul, in addition to next Elul, right, to cover your bases. But the consensus of opinions in our practice is to only be choshesh for the language of the pasuk, as explained to us by the Rambam. Shemitah only is operable as a cancellation of debt at the end of the year, And before the end of the year, you have to do what you have to do in order to avoid that cancellation. And one of the things you can do to avoid that cancellation is what we're going to get into now, the prusbul, right? And this is really the last topic before a little bit of history and a little commentary about the way that prusbul has been co-opted and used as an example of radical halachic change, when really the reality of it is much more subtle, which we will see, much more in consonance with halachic values and laws that are already on the books. So here we go. We'll start with the Mishnah, right? We're in the source sheet where it says prusbul. The Mishnah says a loan secured by a prusbul is not canceled. Right? So in other words, if you have a loan, in general, a loan is canceled, but a loan that is secured by a prusbul is not canceled. We were told this was one of the things enacted by Hillel the elder, Hillel Zaken, for when he observed people refraining from lending to one another, and thus transgressing what it was written in the Torah, beware lest you harbor the base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. Hillel enacted the prusbul, right? So Hillel saw that exactly what the Torah was concerned with was happening. That because we were demanding that people cancel the debts during Shemitah, so people stopped lending during Shemitah, right? Typically, a period alone was not 30 years or 20 years like it is now. It was a month or 6 months or maybe a year, right? So people getting into the 6th year, going into year 7 of Shemitah would stop lending. That's contraindicated, right? Because we said people need working capital. You're not going to lend to people is going to be a big problem for those who are less fortunate. So Hillel said, let's protect. The purpose of canceling the debts was to give those who are in debt a leg up. But now that there are no loans, that doesn't happen anymore. So Hillel was very concerned about this. So he enacted a prusbul. So let's see the Gemara and get in. Hillel saw that the people of the nation refrained from lending to each other. So he rose and instituted prusbul. According to this, the ordinance of Hillel did not conflict with the Torah law. We'll see in a moment about this. The admiral is to counter the effect of rabbinic law. According to this explanation, the state instituted that even in the present, the sabbatical year would bring a cancellation of debt, despite the fact that by Torah law, the debt still stands. The Gemara asks, right? So the Gemara was very concerned about this Hillel, but is there anything like this where by Torah law, the sabbatical year does not cancel the debt, and the sages instituted that it will cancel? It's as though the sages are instructing the debtor to steal from their creditors, as by Torah law, they still owe money, right? Right? So what's going on here? How is it possible that Hillel enacted a concept that seems to ignore the notion of Shemitat Kesafim? Shemitah is supposed to cancel debts. With a prusbul, you don't cancel debts. How does it work? How do the rabbis have this power? The rabbis can't ignore Torah law. So Abai and Rava, Abai says it's not actual theft. It is an instruction to sit passively and do nothing. Right? It's a shev al tasa. Right? It's just passive. The sages have the authority to instruct one to passively violate Torah law, so long as no action is taken. Rava says no. The sages are able to institute the ordinance because property declared ownerless by the court is ownerless, right? So it's one of two possibilities, right? One possibility is that the one possibility is that shev al tasa, right? That Abai is basically saying that today, since Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is Drabanan, so the rabbis, right? Heim Amru Veim Amru, they were the ones that said that it was operable during the times of during today. So they can also come along and say that you can avoid the cancellation of debt through a prusbul. Whereas Rava says Hefker Beis Din Hefker, that even if Shemitah today is D'Oraisa, the Torah has empowered the rabbis to make something Hefker, right? And even though normally, right, so according to Rava, Hefker Beis Din Hefker, according to Abaye, Shemitah today is Drabanan. So that being the case, Rava's approach works even if Shemitah today was even when Shemitah cancellation of debt was Minat Torah, and Abaye's approach only works when Shemitah, cancellation of debt, is only rabbinic. Look at the Rambam. The Rambam says clearly, the principle is effective only in regard to remission of cash debts at the present time being applicable on a rabbinic grounds. The biblical remission, however, cannot be counteracted by the principle at all, right? So principle only works when Shemitah is D'Rabbanan. Right? By the way, this is similar to what we said about Heter Mechira last week. When it came to the agricultural way of working around the sabbatical year, one of the possibilities was selling the land. Right? And selling the land was predicated on the fact that Shemitah B'zman Hazeh is D'Rabbanan. The Rambam saying that's true about a prusbul. Prusbul only works when Shemitah, when the cancellation of debt is D'Rabbanan. Right now, it's interesting because that's the opinion of Abaye. Normally, in a machloket, in a dispute between Rav and Abaye, we hold like Rava. And so it's interesting that here, right, which would say that Shemitah today is Minat Torah, and yet still, after based in Hefker, that prusbul even works when Shemitah is Minat Torah. We don't say that. The Rambam, we seem to like the Rambam. That seems to be the consensus. That we hold like Abaye, that Shemitah today is that prusbul would only be work if Shemitah is D'Rabbanan, and today Shemitah is D'Rabbanan. Just so you know, the Ravid disagrees with the Rambam and holds that prusbul would be operative like Rava. Even B'zman Hazeh, even if today or in the future, Shemitah, cancellation of debts, is a Torah obligation, the Ravid says prusbul would work. So what's the mechanism for prusbul? So we see why Hillel instituted it, and somehow it maintains, it protects the lender's right to demand a loan, to collect a loan even after Shemitah. How does it work? So this is what we have, right? So the Mishnah in towards the bottom, second to last source, tells us how it works. This is the formula principle. I turn over to you so-and-so judges of such and such place, that any debt that I may have outstanding, I shall collect it whenever I desire. Judges sign below or the witnesses, right? So what's the idea, right? So personal debts, you can't collect, right? But the debt that is handed over to a Beit Din can be collected, similar to Otzer Beis Din when it comes to the agricultural workaround, right? Farmer can't work his land. The Beis Din can work his land and hire the farmer to be his employee, right? You can't collect the debt on a personal level because you're supposed to remember that, you know, you don't own everything, right? Hashem owns it all. So if you hand over your debt, your loan to Beis Din, then Beis Din can collect it on your behalf, right? If you look at the next, the previous Mishnah 2 in Parak Yud says that there's this like a separate concept called one who hands over his debt documents to a court, the debts are not remitted. Right, so it's almost like, just for the last point before we get into a little history, Mishnah 2 talks about Mesirat Shtar LeBeit Din, and Mishnah 4 talks about a prusbul. So the question is, are those the same thing? Are those different things? So it's a three-way machlokas to Rishonim. Rashi says it's the same thing. That handing over a shtar, handing over your shtar, your IOU, right? The fact that you're owed money to the Beis Din is the same idea as a prusbul. Tosfos says similarly that Hillel formalized what always existed as a possibility. Right? Mesirat Shtar was always this possibility. Hillel said, let's do this all over the place. Let's always do this so that we can protect the lenders and that so the borrowers can have capital to borrow from. And the Ritva says no. Whereas the Mishnah 2 tells us there have to be an actual formal handing over of the actual documents of the loan. Hillel instituted that just a declaration, a modah, and Beis Din would suffice. That's why he streamlined the process. It's just an interesting point to see how you reconcile these two Mishnahs. Is it just did Hillel formalize what was already there? Is it one and the same? Or did it make it easier? You didn't have to have the documentation. You just made a general statement. Whatever's owed to me, I'll now give to the Beis Din in order to maintain my rights to collect later on. And so that's basically our practice. What's in Mishnah 4 at the end of the source sheet is basically the idea that you and we do it towards the end of the year, before Rosh Hashanah. We don't want to do it too far in advance, because if you have additional loans that you make that are due before Rosh Hashanah, after the Prusbul, it wouldn't apply, right? So you want it like the last week of Elul, whatever the case is, and you do it. Ideally, according to many opinions, there's a statement that you read in front of a Beis Din. We'll talk about the type of Beis Din necessary in a moment, and then you sign it, and you have witnesses sign it. There's a whole question about which Beis Din should you hand off your debts to in order to collect them. The Shulchan Aruch says it has to be a Beis Din Chashuv, right? Which means like a real Beis Din of great rabbis and poskim. Others say no. The Ramah says any three, like Hatar Sidarim type of Beis Din, and anyone and everyone. So we kind of, I'm not sure. I'll have to hear closer to Prusbul time which document we'll use. But I just saw a very nice Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Lichtenstein agree that a good way to do this is for there to be a sitting Beis Din somewhere in the world that's made up of Chashuv Rabbanim, real Chashuv Rabbanim, right? Like the Gedolim that are recognized by all, and the debts are handed off to that Beis Din, and then you make the declaration in front of 3 witnesses that constitute a Beis Din also, right? They're not a Beis Din Chashuv, but they're a regular Beis Din, because there's a question whether you can hand off. Remember, Mesira Shtar meant you actually handed your documentation to the Beis Din. So can we say, oh, we're giving our loans to a Beis Din of Rav Shechter, of Willig, and Rav Rosenzweig? Can we do that? They're not here, right? So on the one hand, they're a Beis Din Chashuv, we're not a Beis Din Chashuv. On the other hand, we're here and they're not. So Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Yosef said, cover your bases. Use a language that transfers the debts to a Beis Din Chashuv, whoever creates that, and do it in front of 3 people, so that if it's better for it to be in person, you've done it in person. If it's better to hand it off to a Beis Din Chashuv, you hand it off to a Beis Din Chashuv, you sort of covered all of your bases. And there's a question also whether that declaration has to be made orally or it's written down and you sign on the bottom. Is that good enough? Some of these details we will review as it gets closer. I just wanted to end, we have a couple of minutes, with a little bit of, with 2 points, right? Number one, sort of the history of Prusbul. We know that Hillel established Prusbul He'll establish Prusbul in order for people to maintain the system, and it was allowed. But it's interesting to note that for a long time, Jews never did a Prusbul. Like we do it, but for a long period of post-Churban Jewry in the diaspora, they didn't use a Prusbul, right? Since the destruction of the first temple, Shemitah observance has only been rabbinic, and it's really been, according to some, not even a D'Rabbanan, a Zeicher, just a reminder, a remembrance of what once was, and this Zeicher was never meant to be applied, even though we learned the sources that tell us that on a Torah level, Shemitah Kesafim, the cancellation of debts, applies outside the land of Israel. But now that the whole thing is just a remembrance of what once was, maybe they only applied that to Israel itself, and there is no need for a Prusbul. Cancellation of debts don't occur in the diaspora, because nowadays it's only a remembrance of what once was, right? So there is that. Nonetheless, right? Throughout the ages, there were many great rabbis who felt that even though that wasn't the practice, it should have been the practice. We should think in terms of cancellation of debts being operable, and therefore utilize the framework that Hillel either created or made popular, however you understand it. The Rush, who we mentioned before, who holds that Shredder Prusbul a couple months ago, the Rush, when he became the rabbi in Spain, 14th century, he tried to introduce Prusbul to his community, and he writes that he wasn't able to get people to do it, right? My grandfather never did it. Why should I do it, right? So, 700 years ago, you run into the same problems that we do now when we try to bring attention to what you might say overlooked halacha, right? So, but it's whether it's just a zeichel mikdash, and today, since the land of Israel is so vibrant and such a part of who we are, it makes sense for Shemitat Kesafim, or you hold that it's actually an obligation to be concerned with the cancellation of debts and prosbul. Nonetheless, it is certainly certainly in the last 150 years, it has come back as a law that is much more practiced. Just one last point, and then one last point, and then one really last point. And the last point is that many have the custom that after you write a prosbul towards the end of the year, because you want all your real debts, loans, to be covered by the prosbul, you lend someone a little bit of money, and you allow Shemitah to cancel that debt, right? So you're yotzei the mitzvah of canceling a debt due to Shemitah, but you do both. You make a prosbul, then after the prosbul, you lend someone money, and you tell them that you're not going to ask for it back. Lastly, in the last 50, 60, 70 years, oftentimes when people were asking that halacha and poskim engage in radical reinterpretation, right? Or in some way, in response to new sociological realities, to change halacha in some way. When there was resistance to do so, they would say, what about prosbul, right? So like the famous example is trying in some way, and it's real. Unfortunately, it's a problem nowadays. Trying to avoid a modern day aguna situation, right? In the old days, you were aguna because your husband went off for business and never came back, and you don't know what happened to him. Nowadays, we know where they are, and they're recalcitrant. They're purposely withholding a get, right? It's not the way the system was meant to be. Okay, so let's do something about it. Let's create a different type of ketubah, a different type of prenuptial agreement, a different type of marriage ceremony that avoids that possibility, right? And there were some kedushin al tanai, right? Hafkas kedushin, all types of things that were floated around in the 1960s and 70s, and oftentimes they say, what about when they were rebuffed? When people like Rav Soloveitchik would say you can't do that. What about prosbul? What about Hillel? Was Hillel not an Orthodox rabbi, right? So Rav Soloveitchik spoke about this at length in different ways, but this is a particularly compelling argument that he makes. He says at the end of World War II, the Nazis were very close to developing their own atomic bomb, right? And this led to a race among the Allies to be the first to create the atomic bomb, which they did, and they dropped it in Japan, and that basically ended the war, right? So one could say, right, that it was the idea of the possibility of the Nazis winning the war that led to the invention of the atom bomb. But that's not really what happened, right? Right? It provided you can't invent the atomic bomb just by means of the fact that the Nazis were pursuing it. That was the impetus, but you had to work within the laws of nature to figure out how do you split the atom to create the boom that creates the atom bomb. And so the Rav said that in a similar way, there are impetuses in sociology and the changes that are going on around us, right? But that can be the reason why we reevaluate. That can be the reason why we re-examine, but that can't change the laws, right? Just like the fact that the Axis powers were seeking an atomic bomb didn't automatically lead to the Allies getting it. So too, different changes in sociology and history in the culture around us doesn't allow us to change the rules of halacha, right? And but right, so halachic change works like scientific laws, right? And there can be creativity, right? When you think about advances, you think about advances in technology, science, right? Now, how do advances in science take place? Do you change the laws of gravity? No, you work within the laws and you figure out a way of working within the laws to create the outcomes that you need based on the circumstances surrounding, right? Understand their essence, unlock their secrets, apply them to the answers that we need in them moments, right? So, right, and so maybe we could have spent a little bit more time on this, but Pruzbul was not a break from the laws of Shemitah. It was utilizing the laws and understanding the circumstances that they were in, and applying those laws in a way that would create the outcomes that Hillel felt were necessary and that were justified and legitimate in light of the halachic reality, right? And that is a type of innovation and development that's perfectly fine. Can't change the rules of the game. You can reevaluate the rules to decide whether or not something's worth rethinking, right? Another example I saw, the Wright brothers would have never gotten their plane off the ground if they wanted to change the rules of gravity. The laws of gravity are the laws of gravity. How are you going to deal with the laws of gravity in order to create an airplane, right? So that's the same thing here. The laws associated with Shemitah, Bizman Hazeh, the laws of Shemitas Kesafim, they apply, right? How are you going to, knowing what you know and seeing the reality of the situation, how are you going to utilize those laws? And we don't believe that where there's, what's the expression? Where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. That was made famous by a certain modern Orthodox thinker and educator. We don't believe that. We believe that it's worth exploring the halacha if there's a need, but sometimes you have to do so with a tremendous degree of kavod rosh, with seriousness, with a healthy degree of humility. And if by re-examining it, you come out with ways that will be more amenable to the situations at hand, then of course it's perfectly legitimate. Because one thing we're not afraid of is change. Change is not a problem, right? Change within the system as exists. We give tremendous amount of credence and respect to the system. You can't change the system, but the outcomes can be changed. Halacha is not static; it's dynamic and creative. So we will stop there. This concludes this mini-series on the topic.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Let me see.
Thank
I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'm happy to answer any.
Rabbi Weinstock?